A racist officer arrests a black homeless man, unaware of who he really is. This unexpected twist will reveal a shocking truth that will change everything. Subscribe and post in the comments where you watch this video. Marcus James had everything one could imagine. A name synonymous with success, an empire built from nothing, and a life as far removed from hardship as a man could get. Yet, standing in his luxurious office overlooking the city skyline, Marcus found himself staring past the shimmering glass, lost in thought. The weight of his past lingered, heavy with memories of struggles, the quiet but cutting sting of prejudice, and the constant need to prove himself more than his skin, his background, or his circumstances. He'd spent years building his real estate empire, buying properties and turning them into symbols of wealth and prosperity. Success and fortune had changed his life. No one dared to look down on him now, but something in that bothered him. It was as if, along with his status, he'd been handed an invisible shield that distorted how the world saw him. People treated him like an exception, a rare success story that shouldn't exist. Even among his peers, there were whispers, subtle and barely masked. A colleague once joked at a corporate gala, his voice light with an attempt at humor, but edged with condescension. "You've sure broken the mold, Marcus. Can't say there are too many of you up here at the top." The words had stung, but Marcus had brushed them off, telling himself it didn't matter. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the comment, it was the mentality that came with it. In their eyes, his success was an anomaly, a story that didn't belong to the usual narrative. And every time someone reminded him of that, he was forced to confront a hard truth. In their world, he was tolerated, even celebrated, as long as he remained untouchable, unattainable, and, most importantly, wealthy. The turning point came one evening at a charity gala hosted by one of the city's elite business figures. Marcus had been invited to speak about his journey to success, a tale he had grown tired of telling, yet it was the price of his place among them. As he recounted his story, eyes watched him with admiration, but also with something colder, a detached curiosity, as though he were a specimen on display. In the middle of his speech, Marcus caught sight of a homeless man outside the glass walls of the event hall, shivering in the cold, his worn, threadbare coat barely offering any warmth. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that instant, Marcus felt the weight of the contrast. Here he was, applauded for his rise, surrounded by opulence, while just beyond the glass stood a man whom society had abandoned. He could see the contempt in the man's gaze, a look that echoed the disillusionment of someone who had been overlooked and discarded. That night, Marcus lay awake, wrestling with questions he had avoided for too long. He was privileged, yes, but did that privilege shield him from the reality that most people of his background faced? Did it make him blind to the prejudice and harshness that had once been his daily life? He thought about the man outside the gala hall, about others he'd seen struggling on the streets, and it gnawed at him that he no longer understood what they felt. He had become so entrenched in his success that he had lost touch with the struggles of ordinary people. The decision formed slowly, like a seed planted that would not be ignored. By the early morning hours, it had grown into a clear purpose. He would walk in their shoes. He would put away his privilege, his wealth, his status, everything that made him untouchable. For once, he would experience the world not as Marcus James the millionaire, but as someone stripped of all the advantages wealth had given him. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning. He had to prepare carefully. No one could know what he was doing, not even his closest friends or his staff. It was a radical experiment, one that even he wasn't sure he could see through. But the drive inside him was stronger than the fear of discomfort or even failure. He would experience life as a homeless man, and not just for a night or two. He was committed to seeing it through, to understanding the depth of pain and prejudice that lay beneath the surface. Marcus began by gathering what he needed. He bought tattered clothes from a second-hand shop in a part of the city he had once vowed never to visit again. The clothes reeked of mildew, and as he tried them on in the dim, cracked mirror of his hotel room, he barely recognized himself. Gone was the crisp suit and polished shoes. In their place were threadbare jeans, a faded jacket with frayed cuffs, and shoes that pinched in all the wrong places. Each step in his transformation felt surreal. He trimmed his nails unevenly, scraped his palms against rough surfaces to add a layer of grime, and smudged dirt on his face. In the mirror, he saw himself changing, piece by piece, becoming someone else. The suit was a shield, he realized. The polished shoes, the groomed appearance, all of it protected him from judgment. But now, standing in worn, shabby clothes, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't since he was a young man struggling to prove himself. His housekeeper knocked on the door that evening, asking if he'd like his suit pressed for the morning's meetings. Marcus froze. The life he was leaving behind seemed to cling to him, resisting his departure. He dismissed her with a gentle excuse, feeling the weight of his decision settling on him. Once she left, he picked up his wallet, removing every trace of his identity except a few crumpled dollar bills. No credit cards, no ID, just cash enough for a few meals, and only that. He was determined to be as anonymous as the people society chose not to see. The final step was leaving his phone behind. The device had become an extension of his existence. Emails, messages, news, all filtered through that small, glowing screen. But now, it lay on his polished mahogany desk, lifeless, silent. He felt a pang of vulnerability as he left it there, but it was a part of his vow to experience reality unfiltered and unshielded. Before stepping out, he took one last look around his home. The grand staircase winding up to rooms he wouldn't see for a while. The art on the walls, the silent luxury of it all. It was strange to think that he, who had always been an outsider fighting his way in, was now choosing to walk away from it all. With a final glance, Marcus closed the door and walked down his driveway, leaving behind the life he had built. The city lights shimmered in the distance, bright and indifferent. He was no longer Marcus James, the successful entrepreneur. He was just another face, another soul among the thousands who lived unseen, unnoticed, and unloved. The night air hit him with a cold bite, and he wrapped the thin jacket tighter around his frame. As he took the first few steps down the street, he felt a mix of dread and excitement, a strange thrill born from both fear and purpose. This was it, the beginning of his descent into an unfamiliar world, a journey into the raw, unvarnished reality he had longed to understand. As Marcus took his first few steps away from his life of privilege, the city around him seemed different, sharper in its cold indifference. The street lights cast long shadows across cracked sidewalks, highlighting the littered refuse of a day that had long since ended for the wealthier residents of the city. With each step, the world became quieter, save for the distant hum of traffic, a murmur of voices, and the occasional clatter of an unseen figure shuffling through an alley. It wasn't long before Marcus began to feel the cold seep into his bones. He had underestimated how biting the night air could be, even with a jacket. Pulling it tighter around him, He realized with a pang of unease that this thin layer was his only protection against the chill. He had money in his pocket, just enough for a few days' worth of food and perhaps a night or two in the cheapest accommodations. But that money was dwindling fast, and every dollar he spent brought him closer to the reality he sought to understand. After walking aimlessly for hours, he found himself on the edge of a busy street lined with coffee shops and small diners. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the morning, when he'd had his last comfortable meal. Summoning his courage, he stepped into one of the smaller diners, hoping to get a simple cup of coffee and a chance to warm up. The harsh, fluorescent lights cast an unforgiving glare over the room, making him acutely aware of how out of place he must look. The server behind the counter eyed him warily, her lips pressing into a thin line as she sized him up. Marcus approached, his steps hesitant. "Coffee, please," he murmured, fishing $1 from his pocket. The server's eyebrows rose as she took in his appearance, and for a second it looked as if she would refuse him service. She glanced down at the worn clothes, the grime on his hands, and then shot a quick look at a nearby customer who was watching them with mild distaste. Marcus felt a pang of discomfort, a sinking feeling of shame that he couldn't quite place. For the first time, he was the one being judged, dismissed, seen as someone unworthy of even the simplest kindness. "Sure," she finally said, her tone grudging, as if she were doing him a favor. He took a seat by the window, feeling the eyes of other patrons on him as he sipped the coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, and the small act of drinking it did little to ease the cold settling in his body. Around him, conversations continued in hushed tones, punctuated by furtive glances in his direction. He could hear snatches of their words, laced with judgment and suspicion. "Looks like he's been out on the streets for a while," he overheard someone murmur. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to ignore the stares. He had never been on this side of society's gaze before, never felt the sting of being an outsider so acutely. The realization was sobering, a bitter reminder of the distance he'd traveled from his comfortable world. Here, he was invisible, a nuisance to be tolerated at best. After finishing his coffee, he left the diner, deciding he couldn't bear the silent hostility any longer. Out on the street, the wind had picked up, slicing through his thin clothing and chilling him to the core. He wrapped his arms around himself, beginning to understand just how little protection his clothes offered against the elements. It was a small but painful lesson in humility, one he hadn't expected to learn so soon. By the time dawn began to break, Marcus was exhausted. His feet ached, his stomach gnawed with hunger, and every inch of his body cried out for rest. He searched for a place to sleep, his eyes scanning the quiet streets for any sign of shelter. Finally, he found a narrow alleyway sheltered from the wind, littered with cardboard boxes and scraps of discarded fabric. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He lay down on the cold concrete, his makeshift bed barely offering any relief from the chill. As he closed his eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Every sound, a passing car, a distant shout, made him tense, a stark reminder of just how exposed he was. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not in this world, not when every moment was a fight for survival. The next day was harder. Hunger clawed at his insides, a dull, relentless ache that reminded him of just how little he had to rely on. He spent the morning wandering the streets, searching for food or a warm place to rest, but everywhere he went, he was met with the same cold stares, the same unspoken judgment. Strangers averted their eyes as he passed, giving him a wide berth as if his very presence were a contamination. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus found himself drawn to a park where several homeless people were gathered, some resting on benches, others huddled under trees for shade. He hesitated, unsure if he belonged among them, but a part of him knew that this was where he would find the understanding he sought. He was no longer Marcus James, the businessman. He was just another face in the crowd. He took a seat on an empty bench, his eyes scanning the others around him. They were men and women of all ages, some as young as teenagers, others well into their 70s. Their faces were etched with lines of hardship, their eyes carrying the weight of stories left untold. They spoke in quiet voices, sharing cigarettes and scraps of food, each one a small act of camaraderie in a world that had forgotten them. As he sat there, one of the men, a middle-aged figure with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard, approached him. "First time on the streets?" the man asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Marcus nodded, unsure of what to say. The man took a seat beside him, studying him with a discerning gaze. "Gotta get used to people looking at you like you're nothing," the man continued, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "They think we're invisible, or worse, but we get by." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for the man's words, simple though they were. In this stranger's presence, he felt a rare sense of acceptance, a small flicker of belonging. "My name's Jack," the man said, extending a hand. Marcus took it, surprised by the strength in Jack's grip. "Marcus," he replied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. Jack chuckled. "Fancy name for a guy down on his luck, eh?" Marcus managed a small smile, the first one he'd worn in days. In that brief exchange, he felt a strange sense of kinship, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, there was still humanity, still a shared understanding. Over the next few days, Marcus learned the rules of survival on the streets. Jack showed him where to find food, where to sleep without being disturbed, and how to avoid the places where the police were quick to hassle anyone who looked out of place. The lessons were harsh, but they kept him safe, giving him a new perspective on the world he had once controlled. But the reality of his situation continued to gnaw at him, especially when he saw the disgust in people's eyes. He was reminded of his privilege every time he reached for a scrap of food or accepted a handout. The contrast between his life as a millionaire and his life now stark and unforgiving. One night, while they sat around a makeshift fire, Jack shared his story, a tale of a man who had once been like Marcus, successful and respected, until one bad decision had taken everything from him. Listening to Jack, Marcus felt a surge of empathy, a recognition of the fragility of fortune and the fine line between success and ruin. It was then that Marcus realized his experiment was no longer just about understanding life on the streets. It was about confronting his own fears, his own insecurities, and the unspoken truths he had buried beneath his wealth. This world, harsh and unforgiving as it was, offered a kind of honesty he had never known, a reminder of the person he had once been before success had built walls around him. For the first time, Marcus felt a flicker of purpose, a desire not just to survive, but to learn, to understand the humanity hidden beneath the poverty and prejudice. And as he lay down that night, his body aching from the day's trials, he knew that his journey had only just begun. By the third week, Marcus felt the full weight of his decision bearing down on him. The initial discomfort had morphed into a dull, constant ache, a physical and emotional exhaustion he could neither shake nor ignore. Hunger had become a familiar, gnawing sensation, and the constant vigilance required to protect himself from theft or assault drained him. As the days passed, he'd become accustomed to the indifferent looks, the averted gazes, and the almost invisible barriers people put up as they passed him on the streets. He felt like a ghost haunting the city he had once owned. One particularly cold afternoon, he stood near a busy shopping district, hoping to find a few coins. His mind drifted to warmer thoughts of his past life, the ease and comfort of sitting in his office with a hot coffee, the satisfaction of closing a big deal. Those memories, once a source of pride, now felt like taunts, an entire world that felt as unreachable as a distant star. A sharp voice shattered his reverie. "Hey, buddy, you don't belong here." Marcus turned to see a tall, white man in his 30s glaring at him with disdain. The man's expensive coat and polished shoes stood in sharp contrast to Marcus's worn clothes and grimy appearance. Marcus felt a flicker of anger, quickly smothered by a reminder that he was no longer Marcus James, the millionaire, but just another vagrant on the streets. "What's the problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral. The man scoffed, his eyes narrowing with a look of contempt that Marcus hadn't experienced in years. "Problem? You're the problem. Standing around here begging for money. Why don't you get a job like the rest of us?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus knew he was witnessing the raw, unfiltered prejudice he'd been shielded from for years. Before he could respond, the man sneered, his voice dropping to a mutter meant only for Marcus's ears. "And people wonder why they end up on the streets," he said with a mocking laugh. "Maybe if you people worked as hard as you complain, you wouldn't have to stand around like this." Marcus felt his fists clench, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger. But he knew better than to react. Here, in this life, he had no power, no authority. Any response could lead to trouble, and he couldn't afford that. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath, letting the insult wash over him. "Have a good day," he managed, turning away before the man could respond. The encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder of the casual cruelty that lay hidden beneath society's polished exterior. He'd heard stories of such discrimination, but experiencing it firsthand was another matter entirely. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way people looked at him, as if his existence was a stain on their otherwise orderly world. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself growing more frustrated and disillusioned. He had expected to face hardship, but the constant undercurrent of racial hostility shocked him. Every interaction felt like a reminder of the world's willingness to judge and dismiss people based on their appearance, their poverty, or the color of their skin. That evening, as he searched for a place to sleep, his thoughts were interrupted by the sharp crack of a voice behind him. "Hey, you! Hold it right there!" Marcus froze, feeling a sudden surge of fear. He turned to see a police officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, walking toward him with purpose. The officer's hand rested on his belt, fingers brushing the handle of his baton. Marcus's stomach dropped as he realized he was about to face another harsh reality of life on the streets. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, his tone harsh. I'm just looking for a place to sleep," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized Marcus, his gaze lingering on the torn clothes and unshaven face. "We've had complaints about people loitering around here, causing trouble. You fit the description." Marcus felt a pang of indignation rise within him. "I'm not causing any trouble, just minding my own business." The officer's expression hardened, his grip tightening on his baton. "Watch your tone," he warned. "You people think you can just do whatever you want around here, don't you?" The words stung, their implications clear. Marcus could feel the weight of the officer's gaze. the barely concealed contempt and suspicion. In his old life, he would have had lawyers, connections, the privilege of status to protect him. But here, stripped of all that, he was vulnerable, exposed. Any wrong move, any hint of defiance, could lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. The officer took a step closer, his face inches from Marcus's. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice low and menacing. "If I catch you around here again, you're going to regret it. Understand?" Marcus nodded, feeling a knot of humiliation and anger tightening in his chest. "Yes, sir." The officer smirked, satisfied before stepping back. "Now get out of here," he ordered, motioning for Marcus to move along. Marcus walked away, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly at the mercy of someone else's judgment. The encounter left him shaken, a harsh reminder of the prejudice that lay simmering beneath society's surface. As he made his way to a quieter part of the city, he felt the weight of his own insignificance pressing down on him. That night, sleep was a distant luxury. He lay on the cold concrete, his body aching, his mind racing with thoughts of the day's encounters. He felt a gnawing sense of injustice, a bitter awareness of how easy it was for people to dehumanize those they deemed unworthy. It was a feeling he had never truly understood before, a perspective he had been shielded from by the walls of wealth and privilege. The next day, Marcus found himself walking through the city with a new sense of caution. The police presence was a constant, oppressive force, and every time he saw an officer, he felt a flicker of unease. He noticed how they looked at him, their eyes scanning him with a cold, assessing gaze, as if waiting for him to step out of line. He was no longer a person in their eyes, just a potential problem, a nuisance to be managed. At one point, he found himself standing outside a grocery store watching as a family loaded bags of food into their car. The smell of fresh bread wafted toward him, making his stomach clench with hunger. He hadn't eaten since the day before, and the hunger pangs had become a constant, gnawing presence. Summoning his courage, he approached the store, hoping to buy something cheap with the few coins he had left. But as soon as he stepped inside, he felt the eyes of the cashier on him, her expression shifting to one of suspicion. He could feel the judgment in her gaze, the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong. Every step he took felt like a challenge, a reminder of the invisible barriers that had been placed between him and the rest of society. When he finally reached the counter, clutching a loaf of bread, the cashier's lips tightened. "That's $1.50, she said, her tone cold. Marcus fumbled with his coins, counting them out carefully. As he handed them over, he felt the eyes of other customers on him, their gazes filled with a mixture of pity and disdain. He could feel his dignity slipping away, piece by piece, with every interaction. Outside, he tore into the bread, the dry crumbs filling his mouth as he tried to stave off the hunger. It was a meager meal, but it was all he had. He found a bench nearby and sat down, lost in thought, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. As he sat there, a group of teenagers walked by, their laughter echoing through the street. One of them glanced his way, a smirk crossing his face as he nudged his friend. "Hey, check it out," he said, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Another bum eating scraps. Guess he didn't work hard enough, huh?" The words struck him with a familiar sting, a reminder of the contempt society reserved for those it deemed unworthy. Marcus felt a surge of anger, a simmering resentment that he struggled to contain. He wanted to shout back, to defend himself, but he knew it would only make things worse. In this world, he was powerless, invisible, a nobody. The realization hit him hard, a brutal reminder of the disparity between his old life and his new one. He had once been respected, admired, seen as a success story, but here, on the streets, he was nothing more than a statistic, a face in the crowd, a burden to be ignored or dismissed. As night fell, Marcus found a secluded spot near a deserted alleyway, away from the prying eyes of the world. He lay down, his body aching from the day's trials, his mind racing with thoughts of injustice and inequality. For the first time, he understood the true cost of his experiment, the loss of his humanity, the stripping away of his dignity, the harsh reality of a world that refused to see him. And as he closed his eyes, the cold seeping into his bones, he knew that this journey had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The next day brought a dull, gray dawn, and Marcus woke stiff and sore from another night on the cold concrete. Each passing day weighed heavily on him, deepening his understanding of life without privilege. He'd come to realize that beyond the physical discomfort, beyond the hunger and fatigue, the most devastating part of this existence was the way it stripped away one's humanity. Determined to find some reprieve from the isolation, Marcus headed toward the shelter Jack had mentioned during one of their conversations. Jack, the gruff but kind man who had befriended him, had given him directions to a place he called a haven for the lost. A volunteer-run center where homeless individuals could get a hot meal, a warm shower, and sometimes a listening ear. The idea of being treated with some semblance of dignity was enticing, though Marcus couldn't shake the worry that he might encounter yet more disdain. The center, a low, nondescript building nestled between abandoned shops, appeared more like a refuge than any of the polished establishments in the city. As he stepped inside, the warmth washed over him, filling his weary body with a sense of relief he hadn't felt in weeks. He inhaled the aroma of hot soup and fresh bread, his stomach responding with a sharp pang of hunger. Around him, others sat in chairs, some chatting quietly, others hunched over steaming bowls, absorbed in their meals. He made his way to the front counter, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile greeted him. She was different from the people he'd encountered so far. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a genuine warmth that seemed to radiate from her. "Welcome," she said softly. "Would you like something to eat?" "Yes, please," Marcus replied, feeling his voice catch in his throat. She handed him a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, her hands lingering as she offered them to him. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask," she added, her tone compassionate. Marcus took a seat at an empty table, savoring each spoonful of the hot soup, the warmth spreading through his body. For the first time since beginning his experiment, he felt a glimmer of hope. This place, humble and hidden, was a pocket of kindness in a world that had otherwise turned its back on him. As he finished his meal, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look like you've been through hell." Marcus glanced up to see a woman in her 50s standing beside his table. She wore a worn but clean coat, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her face, though lined with age and hardship, carried an air of quiet resilience. "I suppose I have," he replied, forcing a smile. She took the seat across from him, studying him with a perceptive gaze. "I'm Anna," she said, extending a hand. "Been coming here a while." "Marcus," he replied, shaking her hand. Anna's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing that he was out of place. "First time here?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. He nodded, unsure of how much to reveal. "Yes, it's been an adjustment." Anna chuckled softly, a sound filled with both amusement and sympathy. "I bet it has, People like us, we're invisible out there. To most folks, we don't even exist." Her words struck a chord with him. It was a truth he'd begun to realize, but hearing it spoken aloud brought a new level of understanding. "How did you end up here?" he ventured, hoping his question wasn't too forward. Anna's gaze softened as she leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. "I was a teacher," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Taught for over 20 years. But then I lost my job. Budget cuts, they said. And when you're over 50, it's not easy to find new work. Bills piled up, my savings ran out, and before I knew it—" Her voice trailed off, a shadow crossing her face. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy, his heart aching for her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the loss of a life she had once known. It was a reminder of how easily everything could be stripped away, how fragile security truly was. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, unsure of what else to say. Anna waved a dismissive hand, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It is what it is. Life can be cruel, but we learn to survive." She studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. "You seem different, though, like you don't quite belong here." Marcus hesitated, feeling the weight of her words. "I guess. I'm still trying to figure it out." Anna's smile widened, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "Aren't we all?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands, you can find me here most days. We look out for each other here, you know." Marcus nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Anna. I appreciate that." Over the next few days, Marcus returned to the center, seeking the warmth and comfort it provided. Each visit brought him closer to Anna, whose kindness and wisdom offered a respite from the harshness of the streets. They spent hours talking, sharing stories of their pasts, and slowly a bond formed between them. A friendship rooted in shared hardship and resilience. Anna became his guide, teaching him the unspoken rules of survival. She showed him which alleys were safe to sleep in, where to find food, and how to avoid confrontations with those who sought to prey on the vulnerable. Her knowledge was hard-earned, the result of years spent navigating a world that had cast her aside, and Marcus absorbed every lesson she offered. One evening, as they sat outside the center, watching the last rays of sunlight fade over the city, Anna shared a piece of her story that struck a nerve within him. "I wasn't always invisible, you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a time when people respected me, looked up to me. My students, they were like my own children. I gave them everything I had, my time, my energy, my heart. But when I lost my job, I realized how little I actually meant to the world. I went from being someone to being nothing." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat, her words echoing his own fears. He had built his life on success, on being admired and respected. But here, in this world, all of that was meaningless. His wealth, his accomplishments, they held no value in a place where survival was all that mattered. "You're not nothing, Anna," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." She looked at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, Marcus, but strength doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't put a roof over your head or food on your table. Out here, it's just another word." He nodded, understanding the bitter truth behind her words. Strength, resilience, determination, they were all noble qualities, but in a world that valued wealth and status above all else, they offered little in the way of security. Their friendship deepened over time, and Marcus found himself relying on Anna's guidance and support. She became his anchor, a constant presence in a world that seemed to shift and change with every passing day. Together, they weathered the challenges of life on the streets, finding solace in each other's company. But, as the weeks wore on, Marcus began to feel a growing sense of unease. The deeper he ventured into this life, the more he realized how difficult it would be to leave it behind. He had come here seeking answers, hoping to understand the struggles of the less fortunate. But now, he felt a responsibility, a duty to those he had come to know and care about. One evening, as they sat around a small fire with a few other regulars from the shelter, Anna shared a dream she had. A dream of starting a small community-led program to help people like themselves get back on their feet. "If I ever had the chance," she said, her eyes bright with hope, "I'd open a place where people could come, learn skills, get a second chance. I'd call it the Haven." Marcus listened, moved by her vision. He could see the fire in her eyes, the unwavering belief that despite everything, change was possible. Her words stayed with him, sparking an idea, a flicker of purpose that had been missing since he'd left his old life. As they parted ways that night, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. He realized that his journey wasn't just about understanding the struggles of others. It was about finding a way to make a difference, to use his own experiences and resources to create something meaningful. With Anna's vision fresh in his mind, Marcus lay down on his makeshift bed, the cold air biting at his skin. But for the first time since he'd begun this journey, he felt a glimmer of hope, a reminder that, even in the darkest of places, there was still the possibility of light. And as he drifted into sleep, he knew that, whatever the future held, he would not let Anna's dream fade away. The city had settled into a relentless rhythm for Marcus, and each day he grew more attuned to the subtle but vital survival skills that life on the streets demanded. He had learned to find warmth in bus terminals, to navigate shelters with sparse resources, and to avoid areas where police were quick to hassle anyone who seemed out of place. Most of all, he had come to rely on Anna's advice and friendship. She was a lifeline, a beacon of resilience who, even in the midst of her own struggles, remained committed to helping others. As winter drew near, the weather grew harsher. The cold nights seeped into his bones and the bitter winds bit at his face, cutting through the layers of his inadequate clothing. Hunger had become a constant, gnawing companion, and each meal felt like a rare blessing. Despite the hardships, Marcus found himself adapting to this world, his spirit hardening against the daily trials. He began to recognize the faces of other regulars, those who, like him, moved between shelters and parks in search of food, warmth, and fleeting moments of solace. One evening, Marcus found himself at the shelter with Anna, sharing a bowl of soup. The space was crowded, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. People sat huddled together, eating quickly, as if afraid the meal might be taken from them at any moment. As they ate, Anna leaned over and lowered her voice. "You know," she began, her tone thoughtful, "I've been thinking about what we talked about starting something real. Something that would make a difference." Marcus looked at her, sensing the determination in her eyes. She had spoken of this dream before, her vision of a place where people could come to learn skills, to heal, to find a path out of the darkness. It was a vision that had taken root in his own mind, a flicker of hope that kept him grounded. "I think it's more than just a dream," he replied softly. "I think it's something we could actually do." Anna's eyes sparkled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You really think so? Yes, he said, his voice steady. And not just for the people here, but for everyone who's been forgotten. People like Jack, people like you. If we could give them a second chance, maybe they wouldn't have to feel invisible. They spent the next hour discussing their ideas, sketching out a plan with nothing but words and determination. Anna's eyes lit up as she spoke, her voice growing more animated with each passing minute. Marcus found himself swept up in her passion, the dream of creating a space that offered hope and dignity to those who had been cast aside. But the harsh reality of their situation loomed over them, a reminder of the obstacles they faced. They had no money, no resources, and little support. Their lives were a daily struggle just to survive, and the idea of building something new seemed almost impossible. After they finished their meal, Marcus and Anna walked out into the chilly night, the stars barely visible above the hazy glow of the city lights. Their conversation lingered in the air, a fragile hope that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. Over the next few days, Marcus continued to think about their plan, the possibility of turning Anna's vision into reality. He began to see the people around him not just as fellow wanderers, but as potential allies, individuals with their own skills, stories, and dreams. He watched as they navigated their lives with quiet resilience, each one carrying the weight of their past while forging a path forward. For the first time since he had begun this journey, Marcus felt a sense of purpose, a desire to make a lasting impact. However, not everyone was as hopeful. Some of the others at the shelter viewed him with suspicion, questioning his motives. They had seen people come and go, individuals who claimed to want to help, only to disappear when things got tough. Marcus quickly realized that trust was hard-earned in this world, and even his friendship with Anna couldn't shield him from the skepticism of those who had been betrayed too many times. One evening, as he sat by the shelter's fire with a group of regulars, a man named Ray, a grizzled, wiry figure with piercing eyes, challenged him. "So, Marcus," Ray began, his voice laced with sarcasm, "what's your story? Why are you really here?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus felt the weight of every eye on him. He knew he couldn't reveal the full truth, but he also didn't want to lie. He had come to respect these people, and he knew that honesty was the only path to earning their trust. "I'm here because I wanted to understand what life is like for people who don't have the things I once took for granted," he replied carefully. "I came here to see a different side of the world, and to find a way to make a difference." Ray snorted, his gaze skeptical. "Make a difference? People like you don't make a difference. You come in, you make promises, and then you leave us to fend for ourselves." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and Marcus felt his resolve waver. He could see the pain and bitterness in their eyes, a lifetime of disappointments and broken promises reflected in their stares. "I understand why you feel that way," Marcus said, his voice steady but soft. "I know I don't have all the answers, and I know I can't fix everything, but I'm not here to make empty promises. I want to help build something real, something lasting." Ray's gaze softened slightly, but he still looked unconvinced. "We've heard that before. Why should we believe you're any different?" Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince them. If he was going to make a real impact, he would need to prove himself through actions, to show them that he was willing to fight for their dreams just as much as his own. "I don't expect you to believe me," he admitted, "but give me a chance. Let me show you that I'm committed to this." Ray regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, a reluctant acceptance that carried a hint of respect. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but don't expect us to go easy on you. This world isn't kind, and neither are we." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the work. He joined the volunteers at the shelter, helping to serve meals, clean the facilities, and organize supplies. He spent long hours talking to the people he met, listening to their stories, learning about their struggles, and offering whatever support he could. Slowly, he began to build connections, earning the trust of those who had once viewed him with suspicion. As he worked, he discovered hidden talents and untapped skills among his fellow shelter residents. There was Sam, a former mechanic who had lost his job after an injury; Carla, an artist with a gift for painting who had been forced onto the streets after her gallery went bankrupt; and Frank, a retired chef who now found solace in cooking for the shelter's residents. Each one had a story, a dream that had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. Inspired by Anna's vision, Marcus began to see the potential in each of them. He encouraged Sam to start repairing bicycles for the local kids, using his skills to give back to the community. Carla started painting murals on the shelter walls, transforming the once bleak space into a canvas of color and hope. And Frank, with Marcus's help, began teaching others how to cook simple, nourishing meals, passing on his love of food to those around him. As these small changes took root, Marcus felt a growing sense of fulfillment. He had come here to understand the struggles of others, but in the process, he had discovered a deeper purpose. This was no longer just an experiment. It was a mission, a commitment to helping those who had been overlooked and forgotten. But with progress came new challenges. The shelter faced constant threats from the city council, who viewed it as a blight on the neighborhood. The police were a persistent presence, patrolling the area with suspicion, their eyes scanning the residents as if waiting for an excuse to intervene. Marcus quickly learned that, in this world, even small victories were hard won, and every step forward was met with resistance. One night, after a particularly tense encounter with the police, Marcus found himself questioning his resolve. He was tired, worn down by the relentless obstacles, the endless need to prove himself. He wondered if he was truly capable of making a difference, or if he was simply fooling himself. As he sat alone, lost in thought, Anna joined him, her gaze gentle but unwavering. "You're doubting yourself," she observed. He nodded, unable to hide his frustration. "I thought I could handle this, but it feels like I'm constantly fighting a losing battle." Anna smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Change doesn't come easy, Marcus. It's a fight, a struggle, but you've already done more than most people ever would. Don't let doubt steal that from you." Her words were a balm to his weary soul, a reminder of the strength he had found in their shared dream. He looked at her, his resolve hardening once more. "You're right," he said, his voice firm. "We're not giving up. We'll keep fighting, no matter how hard it gets." Together, they sat in silence, their gazes fixed on the city lights in the distance. In that moment, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, a conviction that he would carry with him as he continued his journey. For the first time, he understood that this was more than just an experiment. It was a calling, a chance to make a difference in a world that had too often ignored those who needed it most. And as he prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that he would not be alone. The morning Marcus returned to his life as a millionaire felt surreal. He woke early, his body stiff from weeks of sleeping on cold concrete and makeshift beds. The moment he stepped back into his luxurious apartment, he felt a strange sense of disconnection. The spacious rooms, filled with the quiet hum of climate control and polished furniture, seemed almost foreign. After weeks in the raw, unfiltered reality of the streets, the trappings of wealth felt hollow, even unnatural. He'd barely crossed the threshold before his housekeeper appeared, her face a mixture of relief and shock. "Mr. James, we were so worried about you," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she took in his disheveled appearance. She moved to fetch a warm towel, clearly struggling to reconcile this worn, thin man with the well-groomed Marcus James she was accustomed to. "Thank you, Claire," he replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She handed him the towel, her gaze filled with unspoken questions. Marcus moved to the bathroom, standing beneath the warm spray of his shower, feeling the grime and hardship of the past weeks wash away. But no amount of scrubbing could erase the memories, the raw, visceral experiences that had become etched into his soul. As he dried himself and changed into his familiar tailored clothes, he felt a heaviness in his heart, a feeling that he was no longer the man he had been before this journey began. Later that day, he returned to his office. His staff and colleagues greeted him with polite smiles and reserved handshakes, their expressions showing none of the skepticism and judgment he had grown accustomed to on the streets. Here, he was Marcus James, the millionaire entrepreneur, a man of influence and respect. But the person they saw felt like a mask, a role he had been playing for so long that he had forgotten what lay beneath it. As he settled back into the routine of his business, he found himself struggling to reconnect with his old life. Meetings, deadlines, business strategies, everything felt trivial compared to the brutal reality he had witnessed firsthand. His mind drifted back to the people he had met on the streets: Jack, Anna, Ray, Sam, and Carla. Their faces haunted him, their stories a constant reminder of the life he had left behind but could never truly escape. In one of his first meetings back, his executive team gathered around him, eagerly discussing the latest property investment. Marcus tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting. The glitzy, polished world of real estate seemed shallow, a mere facade hiding the struggles of those who had been left behind by the system. He could see it clearly now, the contrast between his world of privilege and the world of those he had come to know. As the meeting concluded, one of his associates, Todd, approached him with a bemused smile. "Glad to have you back, Marcus. I hear you've been off on some adventure?" Todd's voice held a trace of mockery, his tone dismissive. Marcus forced a smile, his mind racing with memories of his time on the streets. He wanted to explain, to make them understand what he had experienced, but he knew that most of them would never truly grasp it. To them, the life he had lived for those few weeks was an abstract concept, a distant reality they couldn't or wouldn't relate to. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice measured. "It was eye-opening." Todd chuckled, oblivious to the gravity in Marcus's tone. "Well, I hope you got it out of your system. We've got big plans for the quarter, and I can't wait to see you back in action." Marcus nodded, but inside, he felt a growing sense of frustration. He realized that his life, his position, even his influence, had insulated him from the harsh truths he had only recently come to understand. And now, standing here, surrounded by people who saw poverty and homelessness as distant problems, he felt an urgency to do something meaningful, something real. That evening, he attended a charity gala, a high-profile event he had once anticipated with excitement. The room was filled with wealthy patrons, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Servers moved between them, carrying trays of gourmet hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes, the luxury and elegance a stark contrast to the world Marcus had come from. As he mingled with the guests, he found himself struggling to engage in the small talk and idle gossip. He wanted to tell them about the people he had met, the hardships he had witnessed, but he knew that most of them wouldn't understand. To them, charity was a social obligation, a way to feel good about themselves without truly confronting the reality of poverty. During the dinner, Marcus was called to the stage to give a speech. The room fell silent as he took the microphone, the eyes of the audience fixed on him with expectation. He glanced around, taking in the faces of people who, like him, had lived lives of privilege and comfort, shielded from the struggles of those on the fringes of society. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Tonight, I want to talk about a world that most of us never see, a world that exists just beyond the borders of our own lives, hidden in plain sight. I recently had the opportunity to experience that world firsthand, and I can tell you that it is nothing like the world we know." The audience listened, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and surprise. I met people who have lost everything, people who are intelligent, talented, and kind, but who have been cast aside by a society that values wealth over humanity. These individuals aren't just statistics or problems to be solved. They are people with stories, with dreams, with dignity, and yet they live invisible lives, ignored and forgotten. He paused, letting his words sink in. We have a responsibility to do more than just write checks and attend galas. We have a responsibility to create real, lasting change, to build a society where everyone has a chance to succeed, where no one is left behind. The audience was silent, their faces a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Marcus could see that his words had struck a nerve, challenging them to confront the uncomfortable reality they had long ignored. After the speech, a few guests approached him, their questions polite but hesitant. Some expressed admiration, others curiosity, but Marcus sensed that most of them were simply indulging him, unable to truly understand the depth of what he had experienced. That night, as he left the gala, he knew he couldn't return to his old life without making a difference. He could no longer sit comfortably in his position of privilege, knowing that so many people were suffering in silence. The world he had left behind still haunted him, and he felt a responsibility to use his wealth and influence to create change. In the following weeks, Marcus began laying the groundwork for a new project, a foundation dedicated to helping the homeless, to giving them the support and resources they needed to rebuild their lives. He poured his own money into the initiative, determined to create a place where people could find refuge, learn skills, and regain their dignity. He named the foundation The Haven, a tribute to the dream he and Anna had shared. With the help of volunteers and former homeless individuals like Anna, Jack, and others he had met, The Haven grew into a thriving community center, a place where people could come to find shelter, education, and a sense of purpose. Anna became one of the foundation's directors, her passion and resilience guiding others who had lost hope. Jack started a workshop where he taught practical skills to young men looking to find stable work. Carla's artwork adorned the walls of the center, turning it into a vibrant, welcoming space that reminded people of their worth. Ray joined as well, serving as a mentor and advocate, his gruff demeanor hiding a heart that had longed for purpose. As the foundation grew, Marcus saw the impact of their efforts firsthand. Lives were transformed, individuals who had once been invisible finding new paths, new opportunities. the haven became a beacon of hope, a symbol of what was possible when people came together to make a difference. One day, as he walked through the center, watching the people who had once been strangers now working together as friends and allies, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had set out to understand the struggles of the less fortunate, but in the process he had found something more, a sense of purpose, a mission that gave his life new meaning. Looking back, he realized that the journey he had undertaken was more than just an experiment. It had been a journey of self-discovery, a confrontation with the darker realities of society, and a call to action. He was no longer Marcus James, the detached millionaire. He was a man who had walked the streets, who had seen the world through the eyes of the forgotten, and who had dedicated himself to making that world a better place. As he stood in the heart of the haven, surrounded by the people whose lives he had helped to rebuild, Marcus knew that his journey was far from over. But now, he had the strength, the vision, and the allies he needed to continue the fight for a more just and compassionate world. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. Thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new stories. Leave your thoughts in the comments and be sure to share this video with your friends. Let them see how much you can change too. Watch other videos on our channel and join us again.